The bitter wind howled like a wounded animal as Ruby Porter clutched her infant daughter to her chest, feeling the small bundle grow heavier with each desperate step. The blizzard had come without warning, transforming the Montana prairie into a white wasteland that threatened to swallow them both whole. Her fingers, numb from cold, could barely maintain their grip on little Emma as she stumbled forward, hoping to glimpse any sign of shelter in the gathering darkness of December 1879. Ruby had been a fool to attempt the journey from Helena to Fort Benton alone, but desperation had clouded her judgment. With her husband Thomas 6 months dead from pneumonia, the small homestead they'd struggled to build had become impossible for her to maintain. The letter from her cousin offering a place to stay and work in Fort Benton had seemed like salvation. Now, as the temperature plummeted and the snow rose past her ankles, that hope felt as distant as the warmth of summer. "Just a little further, Emma," she whispered, though her voice was stolen by the wind. "Mama is going to get us somewhere safe." The baby made no sound, hadn't stirred for hours, and that terrified Ruby more than the storm itself. She'd wrapped Emma in every scrap of clothing she could spare, creating a cocoon against her breast. The stage had broken an axle 10 miles from Fort Benton, and the driver had insisted they couldn't wait for help with the storm bearing down. He'd given her directions to the nearest ranch and set off with the other passengers for town. Ruby, burdened with Emma and their meager belongings, had quickly fallen behind. Her foot caught on something beneath the snow, sending her sprawling. She twisted as she fell, protecting Emma with her body, crying out as pain lanced through her ankle. The canvas bag containing everything they owned in the world tumbled away, disappearing into a snowdrift. Ruby lay there, tears freezing on her cheeks, the weight of failure crushing her more thoroughly than the snow that began to cover them. "Please," she sobbed to the uncaring sky, "please help us." The darkness seemed to shift, a deeper shadow moving against the white. Ruby blinked, certain her mind was playing tricks. Then she heard the soft crunch of snow beneath boots, the gentle nickering of a horse. "Madam," the voice was deep, concerned. "Madam, can you hear me?" A man knelt beside her, his face obscured by a scarf and the brim of his hat. Strong hands reached toward her, hesitant. "My baby," Ruby managed to whisper. "Please, my Emma." The man carefully helped her sit up, his eyes, the only part of his face visible, widening with alarm when he spotted the bundle clutched against her chest. "Let me see," he said, his voice gentler now. Without waiting for permission, he pulled back the layers of fabric to reveal Emma's tiny face, still and pale as porcelain. Ruby's heart stopped. "Is she?" The man pressed 2 fingers against Emma's neck, waited what seemed an eternity, then nodded. "She's alive. The little one's sleeping through the coldest night we've had this winter." Relief made Ruby dizzy. The man tucked the blankets more securely around Emma, then met Ruby's gaze with startling intensity. "You'll never freeze again," he said, the promise in his voice as solid as stone. "Not you, not your baby. I'll make sure of it." He introduced himself as Samuel Nash, owner of the Broken Spur Ranch, and before Ruby could protest, he'd lifted her and Emma onto his horse. He mounted behind them, one arm secure around her waist, and guided the animal through the blinding snow with unerring confidence. "I was heading back from checking on the herd when I spotted you," he explained, his breath warm against her ear. "The good Lord must have been watching over you and your little one tonight." Ruby wanted to respond, to thank him, but exhaustion pulled at her with irresistible force. Cradled in the stranger's steady embrace, with Emma safe between them, she surrendered to darkness. The sensation of warmth woke her, so intense it bordered on pain as blood flowed back into her frozen extremities. Ruby's eyes fluttered open to find herself lying on a bed before a roaring fireplace in a rustic but comfortable room. Panic seized her, and she sat up with a cry. "Emma!" "She's right here, madam." Samuel Nash stood from a chair in the corner, a small bundle in his arms. He crossed to her, carefully transferring Emma into her reaching arms. Ruby pulled back the blanket to find her daughter's face pink with healthy color, her tiny mouth working in sleep. "She's fine," Samuel said. "Hungry, I expect, but none the worse for wear. Toughest little thing I've ever seen." Ruby looked up at him properly for the first time. He'd removed his hat and scarf to reveal a face weathered by sun and wind, with eyes the color of a summer sky. A scar ran from his right temple to his jawline, and his dark hair was streaked with silver despite him appearing no more than 35. "You saved our lives," Ruby said simply. "I don't know how to thank you." Samuel shook his head. "No thanks needed. Couldn't leave you out there, and that's the truth." He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, suddenly awkward. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, left some clothes for you there." He pointed to a neatly folded pile on a nearby chair. "And there's warm water for washing behind that screen. I'll leave you to. Tend to the little one. Supper will be ready when you're set." With that, he departed, closing the door softly behind him. Ruby fed Emma, marveling at how normally the baby behaved after their ordeal. Once Emma was satisfied and sleeping again, Ruby took advantage of the warm water to wash away the grime of travel and fear. The clothes Mrs. Winters had provided a simple dark blue dress with a white collar fit reasonably well, though they were a bit loose around the waist. Ruby had lost weight since Emma's birth, worry and grief stealing her appetite. When she finally emerged from the bedroom, Emma cradled in her arms, she found Samuel waiting in a large, open room that served as both kitchen and living area. A woman in her 60s with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun was placing a tureen of something that smelled heavenly on the table. "Ah, there you are," the woman said, her stern expression softening as her gaze fell on Emma. "I'm Ida Winters. Been keeping house for this stubborn man for 15 years now." She nodded toward Samuel, who had risen from his chair at their entrance. "Ruby Porter," Ruby replied, "and this is Emma." "Mrs. Porter, please sit and eat," Samuel said, pulling out a chair for her. "You must be famished." "Miss," Ruby corrected automatically, then flushed. I was married, but my husband passed earlier this year." Samuel's expression turned sympathetic. "I'm sorry for your loss." Mrs. Winters clucked her tongue. "Such a young thing to be widowed with a babe." She reached for Emma. "Let me hold this little miracle while you eat, dear." Ruby hesitated only a moment before surrendering her daughter. Mrs. Winters cradled Emma with the ease of long experience, cooing softly as she settled into a rocking chair near the fire. The stew was rich with beef and vegetables, accompanied by fresh bread that Ruby tore into with unexpected hunger. Samuel sat across from her, his own meal barely touched as he watched her eat. "If you don't mind my asking," he said after a while, "what brought you out in weather like this with a baby in arms?" Ruby explained about Thomas, the failed homestead, her cousin in Fort Benton, and the stagecoach accident. Samuel listened attentively, his expression growing darker when she mentioned how the driver had abandoned her to the storm. "Colton stage line," he said, shaking his head. "Jim Colton values schedules over cents. I'll have words with him when next I'm in town." "Please don't," Ruby said quickly. "It's done now, and we're safe thanks to you." Samuel studied her for a long moment. "You're still planning to go to Fort Benton, then?" "To your cousins," Ruby nodded. "As soon as possible. I don't want to impose on your kindness any longer than necessary." "It's no imposition," Samuel said. "And you can't go anywhere for at least a week. This storm's set to blow for days yet, and even once it stops, The trails will be impassable until they're cleared. Ruby's heart sank. Her cousin was expecting her, and the longer she delayed, the more of a burden she would become to this kind stranger. "I can work," she offered quickly, "to earn our keep. I can cook and clean," and Samuel held up a hand. "Please, Miss Porter. You and your daughter are welcome guests, not servants. Rest, recover your strength. There'll be time enough to worry about the future when the snow melts." Mrs. Winters returned Emma, who had begun to fuss, and Ruby excused herself to the bedroom. As she settled Emma at her breast again, she found herself studying the room more carefully. Unlike the sparse frontier cabins she was accustomed to, this room spoke of permanence and even certain refinement. The bed frame was carved oak, the quilts finely stitched. A bookshelf held more volumes than she'd seen outside a schoolhouse. This Samuel Nash was no ordinary rancher. The days that followed fell into an easy rhythm. Ruby woke at dawn, fed Emma, and joined Samuel and the handful of ranch hands who had weathered the storm at the main house for breakfast. She insisted on helping Mrs. Winters with household chores, finding comfort in the familiar tasks. Samuel spent most daylight hours battling the elements to care for his livestock, returning with frost in his beard and exhaustion in his eyes. But he always found the energy to sit with Ruby in the evenings, talking of books and faraway places as if they were old friends. On the fourth night, as they sat before the fire after Mrs. Winters had retired, Samuel asked about Thomas. "He was a dreamer," Ruby said softly, her fingers absently stroking Emma's hair. "Always seeing possibilities where others saw only hardship. We met in St. Louis, where I was working as a seamstress. He painted such a beautiful picture of the life we'd build in Montana Territory. A little piece of heaven, he called it." "And it wasn't," Samuel prompted when she fell silent. Ruby sighed. "It could have been with time, but Thomas wasn't practical. He'd plant before checking the soil, build before measuring the timber. We struggled from the start, and then when I was expecting Emma." She swallowed hard. "He worked himself to exhaustion trying to make everything perfect for her arrival. When the winter came, he was already worn down. The pneumonia took him in 3 days." Samuel reached across the space between their chairs and covered her hand with his. "He sounds like a good man who loved you very much." "He was," Ruby agreed, fighting back tears. "But love isn't always enough, is it?" Samuel withdrew his hand slowly. "No," he said, his gaze fixed on the flames. "It isn't." Something in his tone made Ruby look at him more closely. "You sound as if you speak from experience." A sad smile touched his lips. "Perhaps, but that's a story for another night." He stood, stretching his tall frame. "It's late, and tomorrow I need to start clearing the path to town. The storm's finally breaking." Ruby tried to ignore the pang of disappointment his words triggered. Of course, she needed to continue to Fort Benton as soon as possible. This interlude, pleasant as it had been, was just that, a temporary refuge, not a destination. "I appreciate all you're doing," she said. "My cousin will be worried." Samuel nodded, his expression unreadable. "Sleep well, Miss Porter." The next morning, Ruby woke to find Samuel already gone, his men with him. Mrs. Winters informed her they'd taken the snowplow and several horses to begin clearing the 10-mile track that connected the ranch to the main road to Fort Benton. "Won't be back till nightfall, I expect," the housekeeper said. "That man pushes himself too hard. Has done since the tragedy." Ruby's curiosity was piqued, but before she could ask what tragedy Mrs. Winters meant, Emma began to wail, demanding attention. The day passed slowly. Ruby found herself pacing by the windows, watching for Samuel's return with an eagerness that surprised her. When she finally heard the jingle of harnesses in the yard after darkness had fallen, she had to restrain herself from running to the door. Samuel stomped in, bringing a blast of cold air with him. His face was red from exertion, his clothes crusted with ice, but his eyes were bright with satisfaction. "Road's clear enough," he announced, accepting the hot coffee Mrs. Winters thrust into his hands. "I can take you to Fort Benton tomorrow if you wish." "Oh," Ruby said, unable to hide her surprise at how quickly the moment of departure had arrived. "Yes, that would be. Thank you." Samuel nodded once, then headed to his room to change. When he returned for supper, the easy camaraderie of previous evenings had vanished, replaced by polite but distant conversation. Ruby went to bed early, telling herself the hollowness in her chest was merely anxiety about the journey ahead. The morning dawned clear and blindingly bright, the fresh snow reflecting the sun like a sea of diamonds. Samuel helped Ruby into the sleigh, tucking heavy furs around her and Emma, his movements efficient but impersonal. Mrs. Winters pressed a basket of food into Ruby's hands and kissed Emma's forehead. "You're always welcome here, child," the older woman whispered, giving Ruby's arm a squeeze. "Remember that." The journey to Fort Benton took most of the day. Samuel was mostly silent, answering Ruby's occasional questions with brief responses. As the afternoon wore on, the small frontier town appeared on the horizon, its collection of wooden buildings rising like islands from the snow. "Which house is your cousin's?" Samuel asked as they entered the town limits. Ruby directed him to a small house near the general store, her stomach tightening with nerves. It had been years since she'd seen Cousin Eliza, and their correspondence had been sporadic at best. Samuel helped her down from the sleigh, retrieved her canvas bag, which his men had recovered during the snow clearing, and escorted her to the door. Before Ruby could knock, the door swung open to reveal a thin woman with a pinched expression. "Ruby?" the woman asked, her gaze darting from Ruby to Samuel to Emma with increasing dismay. "We'd given you up for lost in the storm." "Hello, Eliza," Ruby said, forcing a smile. "I'm sorry for the delay. We were fortunate enough to find shelter with Mr. Nash until the roads cleared." Eliza barely acknowledged Samuel with a nod before turning back to Ruby. "Well, you're here now, though I must say your timing is inconvenient. Robert has just taken a position with the railroad that requires us to move to Billings. We leave in 3 days." Ruby felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. "But your letter. You said there was work for me here, a place for us to stay." Eliza had the grace to look uncomfortable. "That was before Robert's promotion. I'm sorry, Ruby, but we simply can't accommodate you and the baby now. There's barely room for our things in the wagon as it is." Samuel stepped forward. "Surely you can at least offer them shelter for the night, madam. They've had a long journey." Eliza bristled at his tone. "I don't believe we've been introduced, sir. Samuel Nash. I own the Broken Spur Ranch." Recognition flickered in Eliza's eyes. The Nash name clearly carried weight, even in town. "Of course, Mr. Nash. Ruby and her child can stay tonight, certainly. And I'm sure we can help find a more permanent situation tomorrow. The hotel is always looking for maids, I believe." The thought of working at the hotel while trying to care for Emma made Ruby's chest tighten with anxiety, but what choice did she have? She turned to thank Samuel, only to find him studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Miss Porter," he said formally. "May I speak with you privately for a moment?" Ruby nodded, following him a few paces away from Eliza's curious gaze. "You don't have to stay here," Samuel said without preamble. "The Broken Spur is a large operation. I need someone to keep the books, handle correspondence, manage the household accounts. Mrs. Winters is excellent with the house itself, but her reading isn't what it once was." He paused, seeming to gather himself. "The position comes with private quarters for you and Emma, good wages, and my word that you'll be treated with the utmost respect." Ruby stared at him, stunned by the offer. "Mr. Nash, I don't know what to say." "It's incredibly generous, but it's not charity," he interrupted, his expression earnest. "I genuinely need the help, and you're educated, capable. I've seen how organized you are, how quickly you learn. It would be a fair exchange." His voice softened. "And Emma would have space to grow, fresh air, good food. Think about it, at least." Before Ruby could respond, Emma began to cry, the sharp, hungry wail that demanded immediate attention. Eliza's expression soured further. "I should see to her," Ruby said. Samuel nodded. "I'll return tomorrow morning for your answer." He tipped his hat to her, nodded curtly to Eliza, and returned to his sleigh. That night, lying on the narrow cot Eliza had grudgingly provided, Ruby stared at the ceiling, weighing her options. The hotel would mean long hours. Emma left with whatever sitter she could afford, a tiny room if she was lucky. Samuel's offer was tempting beyond measure, but something about the intensity of his gaze, the way her heart had raced when he stood close, warned her that accepting might lead to complications neither of them was prepared for. By morning, Ruby had made her decision. When Samuel arrived, hat in hand, she met him on the porch, Emma bundled against the cold in her arms. "I'm grateful for your offer, Mr. Nash," she began. "Samuel, please." "Samuel," she conceded with a small smile, "and I accept with one condition." His eyebrows rose. "Name it." "If at any point the arrangement becomes uncomfortable for either of us, you'll help me find alternative employment without prejudice." Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by something that might have been admiration. "You have my word," he said solemnly. "And I'll have the ranch lawyer draw up a proper contract stating the same, if it would make you feel more secure." Ruby nodded, relief washing over her. "Then we accept your offer of employment." Samuel's smile transformed his face, erasing the lines of worry she hadn't even realized were there. "Mrs. Winters will be delighted. She's grown quite attached to little Emma." Eliza, for her part, seemed relieved to be free of the obligation so easily. By noon, Ruby's meager belongings were loaded onto Samuel's sleigh, and they were headed back to the Broken Spur, Emma sleeping peacefully between them beneath the firs. "Can I ask you something?" Ruby said after they had traveled some distance. Samuel glanced at her. "Anything, Mrs. Winters mentioned a tragedy. I didn't want to pry, but—" Samuel's hands tightened on the reins. For a moment, Ruby thought he wouldn't answer. "I was married once," he finally said, his voice low. "Her name was Caroline. We came out here from Boston in '68, full of grand plans. I'd inherited some money and had this notion of building a cattle empire." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "We were young, foolish. That first winter almost broke us, but Caroline never complained, never suggested we give up and go back east. The second year was better. We built the house, expanded the herd. By the third year, we were actually turning a profit." He fell silent for so long that Ruby thought he might not continue. "In the spring of our fourth year here, Caroline told me she was expecting." The pain in his voice was palpable. "She was so happy, Ruby. We both were, but then—" He swallowed hard. "Complications arose. The doctor from Fort Benton tried everything, but we lost them, both Caroline and our son." "Oh, Samuel," Ruby whispered, her heart aching for him. "I'm so sorry." He nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy. "It was 10 years ago. I've built the ranch into something substantial in that time. The work helped, kept me from drowning in grief. But the house, it never felt like home again, not until recently." The implication of his words hung in the air between them, neither willing to acknowledge it directly. "Thank you for telling me," Ruby said simply. Samuel nodded, then deliberately lightened his tone. "Now, about your duties. I was thinking we could start with organizing the ranch accounts. My system is, well, Mrs. Winters calls it a disaster." Ruby laughed, grateful for the change of subject, and they spent the remainder of the journey discussing the practical aspects of her new position. Mrs. Winters greeted their return with poorly concealed delight, immediately whisking Emma from Ruby's arms and giving Samuel a look that made him flush to the roots of his hair. The housekeeper showed Ruby to her new quarters, a charming suite of rooms in the east wing of the ranch house, complete with a small sitting room, bedroom for herself, and a connecting nursery for Emma. "This is too much," Ruby protested, running her hand over the polished walnut of a writing desk by the window. "Nonsense," Mrs. Winters replied. "These rooms have been empty for years. It's time they were filled with life again." The following weeks passed in a blur as Ruby settled into her new role. The ranch accounts were indeed in disarray, but she found satisfaction in bringing order to the chaos. Samuel respected her ideas, implementing several of her suggestions for improving efficiency. In the evenings, they would often sit together in the library, discussing books or the day's events while Emma played on a blanket between them. As January gave way to February, Ruby realized she had never felt so content, so at peace, since before Thomas's death. The raw edges of her grief had softened, and while she would always love and miss her husband, she found herself increasingly drawn to the quiet strength of the man who had saved them from the storm. Samuel, for his part, seemed to come more fully alive with each passing day. He laughed more, the shadows in his eyes receding. He doted on Emma, bringing her small gifts from his trips to town, a carved wooden horse, a soft rabbit made from scraps of fur. The baby thrived under the attention, growing plump and increasingly vocal. One evening in late February, Samuel returned from Fort Benton with news that sent ripples through their quiet routine. "The railroad's coming," he announced at dinner. "They're extending the line from Helena through Fort Benton, then north. They've been buying up land rights all along the route." Ruby looked up from feeding Emma a spoonful of mashed potatoes. "Is that good for the ranch?" Samuel's expression was thoughtful. "It could be. Easier to ship cattle, better access to markets back east, but it also means more people, more competition." He hesitated. "They've made an offer for a portion of Broken Spur land, the northeast section that borders the river. It's a generous offer." "Are you considering it?" Ruby asked, trying to keep her tone neutral. The thought of anything changing their current arrangement made her uneasy. Samuel studied her for a moment. "I'm considering a lot of things lately that I wouldn't have thought possible a few months ago." The weight of his gaze made her cheeks warm, and she busied herself with wiping Emma's mouth. "I've been invited to a meeting in Fort Benton this weekend to discuss the railroad's plans," Samuel continued. "I'd like you to come with me. Your head for figures would be helpful, and—" He cleared his throat. "There's to be a social gathering afterward, dancing." Ruby's heart skipped. "You want me to attend a dance with you, if you'd like to," he said carefully. "Mrs. Winters has already offered to watch Emma for the night. We could stay at the hotel in town, return the next morning." The prospect of an evening free from responsibility, in Samuel's company no less, was temptingly sweet. "I'd like that very much," she said, "but I don't have anything suitable to wear for dancing." Samuel smiled. "I took the liberty of speaking with Mrs. Ellis at the dry goods store. She's expecting you tomorrow for a fitting. Consider it an advance on your wages if you like." Ruby started to protest, but the hopeful look in his eyes stopped her. "Thank you," she said instead. "That's very thoughtful. The dress Mrs. Ellis helped her select was far finer than anything Ruby had owned before, deep green satin with black velvet trim. Cut modestly but with enough style to flatter her figure, which had regained its curves since Emma's birth. When Samuel came to escort her from her room on Saturday evening, his appreciative gaze made her feel beautiful in a way she hadn't experienced in years. "You look stunning," he said simply, offering his arm. The meeting in Fort Benton was long and technical, but Ruby found herself fascinated by the railroad representative's plans and projections. She asked several pointed questions about compensation for land and water rights that earned her approving nods from Samuel and the other ranchers present. By the time they arrived at the social hall where the dance was being held, Ruby felt a heady mix of intellectual satisfaction and nervous anticipation. It had been so long since she'd attended such a gathering, longer still since she'd danced. Samuel seemed to sense her nerves. "We don't have to stay long," he murmured as they entered. "Just one dance, perhaps, and then we can return to the hotel if you prefer." Ruby squeezed his arm gently. "Let's see how it goes." The hall was transformed by lantern light and early spring flowers. A small group of musicians played in one corner, and couples already filled the dance floor. Ruby recognized few faces, but Samuel was greeted warmly by many, introduced as the man who saved the Chambers herd during last year's drought, or the rancher who stood up to those rustlers from Wyoming. When he finally led her onto the dance floor, one strong arm circling her waist while the other clasped her hand, Ruby felt a flutter of something that wasn't entirely nervousness. Samuel moved with surprising grace for such a large man, guiding her through the steps of the waltz as if they'd danced together 100 times before. "You dance beautifully," she said, looking up into his face. "My mother insisted on lessons," he replied with a self-deprecating smile. "Said no son of hers would clod around a ballroom like a draft horse. I complained bitterly at the time, but I'm grateful for her insistence now. I'm glad you had such a wise mother." Something in her tone made his expression soften. "Emma is fortunate to have you," he said. "You're a wonderful mother, Ruby." The use of her given name, rare in their daily interactions, sent a warm current through her veins. "Thank you," she said softly. "I try to be." The music shifted to a livelier tune, and Samuel led her through a spirited reel that left them both laughing and breathless. They danced for hours, stopping only for refreshments and brief conversations with other attendees. Ruby couldn't remember when she had last felt so carefree, so alive. It was well past midnight when they finally returned to the hotel. Samuel walked her to her door, both of them reluctant for the evening to end. "I had a wonderful time," Ruby said, her hand still resting lightly on his arm. "As did I," Samuel replied, his voice husky. It's been years since I enjoyed an evening so thoroughly." They stood there, the air between them charged with unspoken possibilities. Samuel raised his free hand, hesitated, then gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered on her cheek, and Ruby found herself leaning slightly into his touch. "Ruby," he began, then stopped, conflict evident in his eyes. She understood his hesitation. It was too soon, the memory of their respective losses still too fresh, their current arrangement too precarious. "Good night, Samuel," she said gently, stepping back. "Thank you for the dance." Relief and regret mingled in his expression. "Good night, Ruby. I'll see you at breakfast." As winter gradually yielded to spring, the relationship between Ruby and Samuel evolved in small, subtle ways. Their evening conversations grew longer, more personal. Their fingers would brush when passing documents or cups of coffee, lingering a moment longer than necessary. They developed a comfortable shorthand in their daily interactions, anticipating each other's needs and preferences without discussion. Emma thrived in the ranch environment. She took her first tottering steps in the kitchen, while Mrs. Winters and Samuel cheered her on. Ruby capturing the moment in her memory like a precious photograph. The baby's first distinct word, Sam, brought an expression of such joy to Samuel's face that Ruby had to turn away to hide her tears. In April, a letter arrived from Ruby's parents in St. Louis, responding to the news of her new situation. They expressed cautious approval, her father writing that while the circumstances were unusual, Mr. Nash sounded like a man of substance and character. Her mother's postscript was more direct. If there is affection growing between you, do not let Thomas's memory prevent you from finding happiness again. He would not have wished you to be alone. Ruby read the letter several times, wondering if her feelings for Samuel were so transparent that even her parents, hundreds of miles away, could discern them from her careful descriptions. That evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the prairie in gold and crimson, Ruby found the courage to broach the subject that had been weighing on her mind. "I received a letter from my parents today," she began, keeping her gaze on the distant horizon. "Good news, I hope?" Samuel asked. "Yes, though they ask some pointed questions about our arrangement." Samuel shifted in his chair to face her more directly. "What sort of questions?" Ruby felt her cheeks warm. "They wondered about the nature of our relationship." "I see." Samuel was quiet for a long moment. "And what did you tell them?" "The truth," Ruby said simply. "That you've been kind and generous to Emma and me. That you've given us a home when we had none, work that allows me to provide for my daughter with dignity. Nothing more." There was a careful neutrality in his tone that made Ruby look at him directly. "What more is there to tell, Samuel?" His eyes held hers steadily. "That depends entirely on you, Ruby." Her heart began to race. "What do you mean?" Samuel leaned forward, his forearms resting on his knees, his expression earnest. "I mean that my feelings for you have grown beyond those of an employer for his housekeeper, or even a friend for a friend. I mean that watching you with Emma, seeing your strength and grace every day, has awakened something in me I thought died with Caroline." Ruby's breath caught in her throat. "Samuel," he held up a hand. "Please let me finish. I know it may be too soon. I know you're still healing from Thomas's loss, as I am from Caroline's. But I want you to know that if there ever comes a time when you might consider, when you might see me as more than your employer, I would count myself the most fortunate of men." Tears pricked at Ruby's eyes, not from sorrow but from the overwhelming tide of emotion his words had unleashed. "I do," she whispered. "I do see you as more, Samuel. I have for some time." The hope that bloomed in his eyes was breathtaking. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw, he reached for her hand. His palm was warm and calloused against hers, their fingers interlacing with a rightness that made Ruby's chest ache. "I don't want to rush you," Samuel said softly. "We can take all the time you need." Ruby squeezed his hand. "I think we've both waited long enough for happiness, don't you?" A smile broke across his face like sunrise. "May I kiss you, Ruby Porter?" In answer, she leaned forward, meeting him halfway. His lips were gentle against hers, the kiss sweet and brief, a promise rather than a demand. When they parted, Ruby felt as though something fundamental had shifted in her world, realigning it around this new, unexpected joy. That night, she wrote to her parents telling them that yes, there was indeed something more between her and Samuel Nash, something precious and hopeful that she was allowing herself to embrace. The coming weeks brought a flurry of changes to the Broken Spur. Samuel finalized the sale of the northeastern parcel to the railroad, using part of the proceeds to expand the main herd and improve the breeding stock. Ruby reorganized the ranch's business operations entirely, implementing a bookkeeping system that allowed them to track expenses and profits with unprecedented clarity. But the most significant changes were personal. Samuel began courting Ruby properly, with Mrs. Winters's enthusiastic approval. They rode together in the evenings, picnicked by the creek when weather permitted, and spent long hours talking about their pasts and their hopes for the future. Emma became even more attached to Samuel, demanding to be included in his morning rounds of the ranch, perched before him on his saddle like a tiny queen surveying her domain. In late May, just as the prairie exploded with wildflowers, Samuel took Ruby and Emma on a special outing. They rode to a beautiful spot overlooking the river, where Samuel had arranged for a picnic lunch to be waiting. After they had eaten, while Emma napped on a blanket in the shade, Samuel took Ruby's hand and led her to the edge of the bluff. "I brought Caroline here once," he said quietly. "When we first arrived, I promised her we'd build something lasting, something that would endure long after we were gone." He turned to face Ruby, his expression solemn. "I kept that promise, but the ranch was never enough on its own. A legacy needs family to give it meaning." Ruby's heart began to pound as Samuel reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "I know it hasn't been very long," he said, his voice husky with emotion, "but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. You and Emma have brought light back into my world, Ruby. You've made the broken spur a home again." He opened the box to reveal a ring with a single perfect diamond. "Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife, of allowing me to be a father to Emma and perhaps, God willing, more children in the years to come?" Tears spilled down Ruby's cheeks as joy threatened to burst her heart. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Samuel, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, then gathered her into his arms, his kiss deeper and more passionate than any they had shared before. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Ruby glanced over at Emma, who had awakened and was watching them with wide, curious eyes. "What do you think, little one?" Samuel asked, scooping the baby up into his arms. "Would you like me to be your papa?" Emma patted his cheek with a chubby hand, her expression serious. "Sam Papa," she declared with the certainty only a child could muster, and both adults burst into delighted laughter. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Fort Benton, with Mrs. Winters, the ranch hands, and a few friends from town as witnesses. Ruby wore a new dress of ivory silk, Emma a matching miniature version. Samuel's eyes shone with unshed tears as he spoke his vows, his voice steady and sure. The wedding night was a revelation for Ruby. Samuel was a tender, considerate lover, attentive to her pleasure and patient with her initial shyness. As they lay together afterward, her head pillowed on his chest, Ruby felt a contentment so complete it bordered on bliss. "I never thought I'd find this again," Samuel murmured, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "Love, family, hope for the future." Ruby raised herself on one elbow to look into his face. "That night in the blizzard when you found us, you told me we'd never freeze again. I didn't understand then how completely you'd keep that promise." Samuel pulled her closer. "It was the easiest promise I've ever made, and the one I'm most determined to keep." Summer passed in a golden haze of happiness. The ranch prospered under their joint management, Samuel's practical knowledge of cattle and land combining perfectly with Ruby's sharp business acumen. Emma grew more verbal by the day, toddling around the house and yard with increasing confidence, charming everyone she encountered. In August, Ruby confirmed what she had begun to suspect. She was expecting a child. When she shared the news with Samuel, his joy was so profound that it brought her to tears. He lifted her off her feet, spinning her in a circle before setting her down gently, suddenly concerned he might have hurt her. "I'm not made of glass," she laughed, cupping his face in her hands. "This baby is strong like its father." Samuel placed his hand reverently on her still flat stomach. and brave, like its mother and sister. As her pregnancy progressed, Ruby continued to manage the ranch accounts, though Samuel insisted she reduce her hours as her energy waned. Mrs. Winters fussed over her constantly, preparing special dishes to combat the morning sickness and knitting tiny garments for the coming winter. The railroad construction brought changes to the region. Fort Benton grew more prosperous, and new settlers arrived regularly. Samuel was approached about serving on the town council, a position he accepted after discussing it thoroughly with Ruby. His standing in the community rose further when he organized the ranchers to establish fair rates for cattle shipping with the railroad company. December arrived with unseasonable mildness, much to everyone's relief. Ruby, now 7 months along, found the easier weather a blessing as she prepared for Christmas, Emma's second, but her first with a full understanding of the holiday's excitement. Samuel insisted on cutting the tallest pine tree that would fit in their parlor, and Emma helped decorate it with paper chains and wooden ornaments. On Christmas Eve, as they sat together before the fire, Emma already asleep in her bed upstairs, Samuel presented Ruby with a small package wrapped in silver paper. "It isn't much," he said as she carefully opened it, "but I wanted you to have something special." Inside was a locket of fine gold, oval-shaped with delicate engraving. When Ruby opened it, she found a miniature portrait of Emma on one side, the other empty. "For the new baby," Samuel explained, his eyes warm with love. "So you can keep them both close to your heart, even when they're grown and perhaps far away." Ruby blinked back tears as she fastened the locket around her neck. "It's perfect, Samuel. I'll treasure it always." She handed him a package of her own, watching nervously as he unwrapped it. Inside was a leather-bound ledger, the cover stamped with the Broken Spur brand, and the words Nash Family Chronicles. Samuel opened it to find the first pages filled with Ruby's neat handwriting, documenting their meeting in the blizzard, the development of their relationship, their wedding, and the news of the coming baby. "I thought we could record our family story," Ruby explained. "For Emma and the new baby and any others who might come along, so they'll know where they came from, how much they were wanted and loved." Samuel traced the words on the page with gentle fingers. "This is the most meaningful gift I've ever received," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Our story, it deserves to be remembered." He leaned over to kiss her, his hand coming to rest on the swell of her belly where their child grew. As if responding to its father's touch, the baby kicked vigorously, making them both laugh. "Active little one," Ruby said, placing her hand over his. "Just like Emma was." Samuel's expression grew thoughtful. "I've been thinking about names. If it's a boy, perhaps Thomas, to honor your first husband. He gave me the 2 greatest gifts of my life in a way, you and Emma." Fresh tears sprang to Ruby's eyes at his generosity of spirit. "That would be. Yes, I'd like that very much. And if it's a girl, Caroline," Samuel said without hesitation. "If you wouldn't mind." Ruby smiled through her tears. "Thomas or Caroline, perfect names for a child born of second chances." The new year of 1881 arrived with a proper Montana blizzard, fierce and unrelenting. As the wind howled around the sturdy walls of their home, Ruby sat in the rocking chair by the nursery fire, Emma curled against her side, listening to Samuel read aloud from a book of fairy tales. The baby within her was active, as if dancing to the rhythm of its father's voice. "Are you comfortable?" Samuel paused in his reading to ask, concern evident in his expression. "Should I get you another pillow?" Ruby smiled, reaching for his hand. "I'm perfect right where I am, with the people I love most in the world." Emma looked up drowsily. "Story, Papa, finish story." "As you wish, Princess Emma," Samuel said with exaggerated formality that made the little girl giggle. He resumed rating, his deep voice painting pictures of far-off lands and brave heroes. Ruby closed her eyes, listening to the counterpoint of Samuel's storytelling and the storm outside. The contrast struck her forcefully, the cold and danger of the world beyond their walls, the warmth and safety within. She remembered that terrible night 2 years ago when she had stumbled through a similar storm, certain she and Emma would perish, and the miracle of Samuel finding them in the darkness. "You'll never freeze again," he had promised, and he had kept that vow in ways neither of them could have imagined then. As if sensing the direction of her thoughts, Samuel looked up from the book, his gaze meeting hers over Emma's head. The love in his eyes was so tangible Ruby could almost feel its warmth on her skin. "Are you with us, Mrs. Nash?" he asked softly. Ruby smiled, her hand cradling the new life they had created together. "Always," she replied, "always and forever." When Thomas Nash was born 3 weeks later on a clear, cold January morning, his lusty cries filled the room, bringing tears of joy to his father's eyes. Samuel held his son with reverent hands, marveling at the perfection of his tiny features. "He has your eyes," Ruby said tiredly from the bed, where Mrs. Winters was helping her settle after the long labor. "And your spirit, I'll wager," Samuel replied, bringing the swaddled infant to her, strong and determined. Emma, allowed in to meet her brother once everything was cleaned and proper, approached the bed with uncharacteristic caution. "Baby?" she asked, peering at the bundle in her mother's arms. "Yes, sweetheart," Ruby said. "This is your brother, Thomas. Would you like to touch him?" Emma reached out one small finger to stroke the baby's cheek. "My brother," she said with solemn possession that made the adult smile. Samuel gathered his daughter into his arms, lifting her so she could see better. "That's right, princess. You're a big sister now. You'll help Mama and me take care of him, won't you?" Emma nodded gravely. "I help. I big." "The biggest," Samuel agreed, pressing a kiss to her curls. As he watched his wife and 2 children, a profound sense of rightness settled over Samuel. The family he had thought forever lost to him had been restored in a new form, different but equally precious. Ruby met his gaze over their children's heads, her exhausted face luminous with happiness, and he knew she felt it too, this miracle of second chances, of love found in the aftermath of loss. Outside, the winter wind rose again, rattling the windows of the sturdy ranch house. But within its walls, the Nash family remained warm and safe, bound together by love and the promise of a future bright with possibility. Ruby and Samuel had both walked through the cold darkness of grief and emerged into the light of new love, stronger and more appreciative of life's blessings for having known its sorrows. As night fell and the children slept, Emma in her bed across the hall, newborn Thomas in the cradle beside them, Samuel took Ruby in his arms, holding her with infinite tenderness. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair. "For what?" she asked, nestling closer to his warmth. "For trusting me that night in the blizzard, for giving Emma and me a chance to become a family, for Thomas." He tilted her face up to his. "For making my life complete in ways I never dared hope for again." Ruby reached up to trace the scar along his face, the mark that had once seemed forbidding but now was simply a beloved part of him. "We saved each other," she said softly. "And that's what family does, they keep each other warm against the cold, safe against the storms. Always." "Always," Samuel echoed, sealing the promise with a kiss. And as the winter wind continued to howl beyond their windows, the Nash family slept in perfect peace, wrapped in the enduring warmth of a love that had begun on the coldest night of the year, but would burn brightly through all the seasons of their lives to come.